In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where alien civilizations judge strength by size, technology, and intimidation, humanity often finds itself underestimated. But what happens when those who mistake quiet competence for weakness encounter someone who has survived the unthinkable? Captain Sarah Chen appears to be just another fragile human to the towering Zephyrian warriors and calculating Nexus traitors who dominate the Galactic Council. Her small stature, soft voice, and preference for diplomacy over displays of force make her seem like easy prey in a universe where might makes right. They see her assigned to the remote research station Kepler 442b and assume she's been relegated there because she lacks the strength to handle real responsibility. They couldn't be more wrong. What they don't know is that Sarah Chen is one of the few survivors of humanity's darkest hour, the Siege of New Geneva, where she held a critical defense position for 72 hours against impossible odds while evacuation ships fled with civilians. They don't know about the scars hidden beneath her uniform, or the tactical brilliance that earned her recognition from every major military academy in human space. They certainly don't know that her exile to this research station is actually a cover for humanity's most classified project. When pirates, alien supremacists, and galactic politics collide at her remote outpost, these assumptions will prove catastrophically wrong. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody bothers to notice. This is the story of what happens when the galaxy learns that humans don't just survive, they excel in ways that can't be measured by size or volume of voice. The transport ship Galactic Unity shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, revealing the lonely blue star system that would be Captain Sarah Chen's new home. Through the observation deck's reinforced windows, she could see Kepler 442b hanging in the void like a green and brown marble, its two small moons casting shadows across unfamiliar continents. Not exactly the garden spot of the galaxy, is it? Rumbled Commander Throck, the massive Zephyrian who served as the transport's security chief. His forearms were crossed over his barrel chest, and his reptilian features showed clear disdain as he looked down at Sarah from his 7-foot height. I still don't understand why they're sending someone so small to run a research station in the frontier territories. Sarah kept her expression neutral as she checked her personal datapad. She'd heard variations of this sentiment throughout the 3-week journey from Terra Station. To the alien crew members, she was just another fragile human, barely 5.5 feet tall, with black hair pulled back in a regulation bun and dark eyes that seemed too large for her face. Her service uniform hung loosely on her slender frame, and she spoke in quiet, measured tones that the more aggressive species interpreted as weakness. "The Galactic Council approved my assignment," she replied simply, not bothering to elaborate. There was no point in explaining that her exile to this remote station had been her own idea, or that the research being conducted here was far more significant than anyone aboard this ship could imagine. The Nexus traitor Vex 9 approached them, his pale blue skin shimmering under the ship's artificial lighting. His species was known for their calculating intelligence and their ability to find profit in any situation. "Captain Chen," he said in his melodious voice, "I hope you understand the realities of your position. Kepler 442b is 3 weeks from the nearest patrol route. If pirates or raiders decide to visit your little research station, you'll be entirely on your own." "I'm aware of the isolation," Sarah said, continuing to review her files without looking up. Her personnel record, available to anyone with standard clearance, showed a career notable only for its mediocrity. A few minor postings on peaceful worlds, some diplomatic missions that had ended without incident, and a recommendation for careful consideration of assignment parameters due to physical limitations. What it didn't show was why she'd specifically requested this posting, or what those research projects really entailed. Commander Throck snorted, a sound like grinding stone. 3 weeks is a long time for someone your size to hold off serious trouble. Maybe you should have requested a posting on one of the inner worlds, where the patrol ships actually visit more than once a year. Dr. Ilex, the ship's Alterian medical officer, looked up from her own datapad with something approaching sympathy. Her species was known for their empathic abilities, and she seemed genuinely concerned. The psychological impact of such isolation can be severe, especially for humans. Your species isn't evolved for extended solitude like some others. Sarah finally looked up from her files, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "I appreciate your concern," she said in that same quiet voice. "But I think you'll find that humans are more adaptable than most people assume." As if summoned by their conversation, the ship's captain announced over the intercom that they were beginning final approach to the research station. Sarah gathered her few personal belongings and made her way to the shuttle bay, followed by the others who seemed determined to see her safely delivered to what they clearly considered a form of exile. The research station appeared gradually through the shuttle's viewscreen as they descended through Kepler 442b's atmosphere. It was smaller than most galactic installations, built into the side of a mountain overlooking a vast forest that stretched to the horizon. The architecture was primarily human, with clean lines and practical design, but there were clearly sections that had been added to accommodate other species. Solar collectors gleamed on every available surface, and Sarah could see the distinctive blue glow of the station's main power core through reinforced windows. "Home sweet home," muttered the shuttle pilot, another human who'd been notably quiet during the journey. Sarah had noticed that the human crew members seemed almost embarrassed by her assignment, as if her posting to such a remote location reflected poorly on their entire species. As they settled onto the station's small landing pad, Sarah could see a delegation waiting to greet them. Dr. Marcus Webb, the station's chief scientist, stood in the center of the group, his graying hair and lined face showing the effects of 3 years in this frontier assignment. Beside him was Dr. Kalatvaren, a Volani xenobiologist whose blue-furred face was set in the neutral expression her species maintain in formal situations. The rest of the greeting party consisted of various research assistants and support staff, a mixture of humans and aliens who all looked like they'd been posted here because they didn't fit in anywhere else. "Captain Shen," Dr. Webb said as she disembarked from the shuttle, extending his hand in the human custom. "Welcome to Research Station Echo. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." "Not at all, Doctor," Sarah replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that seemed to surprise him slightly. "I'm looking forward to beginning my duties." Dr. Tverin stepped forward, her large eyes studying Sarah with clinical interest. "Captain, if I may ask, what is your background in research station management?" "Your personnel file indicates primarily diplomatic and liaison positions." Before Sarah could respond, Commander Throck's booming voice interrupted from behind them. "That's what we've all been wondering. No offense to your species, Captain, but this posting seems like it might be challenging for someone of your physical capabilities." The research station staff exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the doubt in their expressions. They'd been expecting someone more imposing, someone who looked like they could handle the responsibilities of commanding a frontier outpost. Instead, they'd gotten a small, quiet woman whose most notable feature seemed to be her complete lack of notable features. "I understand your concerns," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the landing pad despite its quiet tone. "But I think you'll find that effective leadership isn't always about physical presence." She turned to Dr. Webb. "Perhaps you could show me to my quarters and brief me on current operations?" As they walked toward the station's main entrance, Sarah was acutely aware of the conversations happening behind her in various alien languages. She didn't need to understand the words to know what they were discussing. The Zephyrian was probably predicting that she'd be dead within a month. The Nexus trader was likely calculating how much profit he could make from salvaging the station after she inevitably failed. Even her own species seemed to think she'd been given an impossible task. The station's interior was functional but comfortable, with wide corridors designed to accommodate various alien physiologies and artificial gravity maintained at a standard that worked for most species. Dr. Webb led her through the main laboratories, where researchers were examining samples of the planet's unique crystalline formations, and past the communication center where a lone technician monitored signals from across the sector. "We've got 43 permanent staff," Dr. Webb explained as they walked. 31 are researchers in various fields, the rest are support personnel. "We're studying everything from the planet's unusual geological formations to its indigenous plant life, which shows some remarkable adaptive properties." They passed through a section that seemed newer than the rest, with heavier security doors and restricted access panels. Sarah noted the layout carefully, though she gave no outward sign of particular interest. "And this area?" "Classified research," Dr. Webb said shortly. "Above your clearance level, I'm afraid. Even mine, actually. We just maintain the facilities for the researchers who work there." Sarah nodded as if this was perfectly normal, though she knew better than anyone what was really being studied in those restricted sections. The crystalline formations on Kepler 442b weren't just scientifically interesting, they were the key to humanity's most advanced defensive technology. The adaptive plant life wasn't just fascinating from a botanical perspective, it was being studied for applications in medical treatment that could revolutionize battlefield medicine. And the researchers working in those restricted areas weren't just scientists, they were some of humanity's most brilliant military engineers. Her quarters were spacious by space station standards, with a large window overlooking the forest and mountains beyond. As Dr. Webb left her to settle in, Sarah finally allowed herself a small smile. Let them think she was just another failed officer relegated to an unimportant posting. Let them assume that her quiet demeanor meant weakness, and her small stature meant incompetence. They would learn differently soon enough. As night fell over Kepler 442b, Sarah stood at her window watching the unfamiliar constellations wheel overhead. In her reflection on the glass, she could see the faint scars on her neck where shrapnel had missed her carotid artery by millimeters during the siege of New Geneva. Hidden beneath her uniform were the marks left by 3 days of continuous combat, when she'd held Bridge 7 against 4 separate assaults while civilian transports evacuated the city. The Galactic Council had never heard of New Geneva, or the siege that had saved 2 million human lives. They didn't know about the tactical innovations she'd developed under fire, or the way she'd turned a hopeless defense into a strategic victory that military academies still studied. They certainly didn't know that her assignment to this remote research station was actually the most critical posting in human space. But they would learn. When the pirates came, and they would come, because isolated research stations were always tempting targets, they would discover that they'd made a very serious miscalculation. When alien supremacists decided that this outpost would make a good target for demonstrating human weakness, they would find themselves facing an opponent who understood warfare in ways they couldn't imagine. For now, though, Sarah was content to let them maintain their illusions. She had work to do, preparations to make, and a station to prepare for the challenges that were undoubtedly coming. The researchers could continue their studies, the support staff could maintain their routines, and her enemies could continue to underestimate her. It would make their eventual defeat all the more satisfying. As she prepared for sleep in her new quarters, Sarah Chen allowed herself one last look at the peaceful forest below. Soon enough, this tranquil world would become a battlefield. When that happened, the galaxy would learn something important about humanity, something about the difference between being weak and choosing when to show your strength. The lesson was going to be memorable. 3 weeks into her assignment, Sarah had settled into what appeared to be a routine that confirmed everyone's expectations about her capabilities. She attended the daily briefings where Dr. Webb reported on research progress, reviewed supply requisitions with the station's quartermaster, and spent long hours in her office reviewing what seemed like mundane administrative reports. To the station staff, she looked exactly like what they'd expected, a bureaucrat trying to manage responsibilities that were beyond her experience. What they didn't see was that her administrative reviews included detailed analyses of defensive positions throughout the station, weapon inventory reports that officially didn't exist, and tactical assessments of the surrounding terrain. While she sat quietly in meetings, she was mentally cataloging the combat capabilities of each staff member and identifying potential weak points in the station's security. The morning that everything changed started like any other. Sarah was in the communications center, ostensibly checking routine message traffic, when the long-range sensors detected an approaching ship. Technician Rodriguez, a young man who'd been assigned to the station after washing out of navigator training, looked up from his console with mild interest. "Captain, we've got a vessel coming in from the outer system. Transponder identifies it as the merchant ship Prosperity's Dream, registered to the Nexus Trading Collective." Sarah moved to look at his screen, noting details that Rodriguez missed entirely. The ship's approach vector was slightly off the standard commercial route, and its energy signature showed modifications that weren't typical for a merchant vessel. "How long until they reach us?" "About 4 hours at current speed," Rodriguez replied. "Should I send the standard greeting and prepare a landing clearance?" "Not yet," Sarah said quietly. "Continue monitoring and let me know if anything about their approach changes." She left the communications center and made her way through the station with her usual unhurried pace, but her destination was purposeful. The restricted section that Dr. Webb had mentioned during her arrival tour was accessed through a maintenance corridor that most staff avoided. Sarah's clearance codes opened doors that very few people on the station even knew existed. Beyond those doors, Research Station Echo revealed its true nature. Instead of simple laboratories studying crystalline formations, there were fabrication facilities producing advanced defensive systems. The botanical research was actually developing rapid healing compounds that could keep soldiers fighting through injuries that would incapacitate others. And the quiet researchers were actually military engineers working on projects that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. Dr. Elena Vasquez looked up from her workstation as Sarah entered the main development lab. Unlike the other researchers on the station, Vasquez knew exactly who Sarah Chen really was and why she'd been assigned here. "Captain, we weren't expecting you until this afternoon's briefing." "Change of plans," Sarah said, moving to the tactical display that showed the station's surroundings in 3 dimensions. "We have an incoming ship that's flying under merchant credentials, but showing energy signatures consistent with a converted raider. I need a full defensive assessment." Vasquez was already moving to her console, her fingers dancing across controls that brought the station's hidden sensors online. "The Prosperity Stream, I'm seeing the same anomalies you are. Weapons modifications disguised as cargo handling equipment, enhanced shielding, and, interesting. Their communications array has been upgraded with military-grade encryption systems." "Pirates?" asked Dr. James Mackenzie, another of the military engineers, as he looked up from his work on what appeared to be a simple geological scanner but was actually a sophisticated weapon targeting system. "Possibly," Sarah replied, studying the display. "Or someone using piracy as a cover for other activities. Either way, we need to be prepared." She activated the station's classified communication system, sending encrypted signals that would alert certain personnel to begin preparations without alarming the general population. What happened next was a carefully orchestrated dance that the station's civilian researchers never noticed. Maintenance personnel began routine checks that happened to involve accessing weapon storage areas. Research assistants started conducting experiments that required them to move sensitive equipment to secure locations. And several staff members who'd seemed like ordinary technicians began making their way to positions that would allow them to control the station's defensive systems. Sarah returned to her office and settled in to wait, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether months of preparation had been sufficient. She pulled up the station's official personnel files and began reviewing them as if preparing for a routine inspection, but her real attention was on the tactical situation developing outside. The Prosperity's Dream made its final approach with all the appearance of a legitimate merchant vessel. Captain Zex Corvani, according to the communication logs, was a Nexus trader seeking to establish regular supply runs to frontier research stations. His ship requested permission to land and begin negotiations for ongoing service contracts. It was Dr. Webb who came to Sarah's office to discuss the situation, clearly expecting her to defer to his judgment about commercial matters. "Captain Chen, this could be exactly what we need. Our supply runs from the inner worlds are expensive and irregular. A local trading relationship might solve some of our logistical problems." Sarah looked up from her files with the same quiet expression she'd maintained since arriving at the station. "What do you know about Captain Corvani?" "Well, nothing specifically," Webb admitted. "But the Nexus Trading Collective is a legitimate organization. They have commercial relationships throughout this sector. Have you verified their credentials with the collective?" Webb shifted uncomfortably. "Communications to the inner worlds take several days for a response. I assumed we could conduct preliminary discussions while waiting for confirmation." Sarah nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable while making mental notes about security protocols that needed to be reinforced. "Very well. Grant them landing permission, but limit their access to the main docking bay and adjacent areas. I'll meet with Captain Corvani personally." The Prosperity's Dream settled onto the station's landing pad with the smooth efficiency of a ship that was exactly what it claimed to be. Sarah watched from the control center as the crew disembarked, noting details that the civilian staff missed entirely. The traders moved with military precision, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings in patterns that suggested combat training. Their equipment was a little too new, their uniforms a little too clean for merchants who supposedly spent months traveling between remote outposts. Captain Corvani himself was exactly what Central Casting would have ordered for a Nexus trader, tall, elegant, with the pale blue skin and melodious voice that made his species natural diplomats and negotiators. He greeted Dr. Webb with appropriate courtesy and expressed all the right sentiments about the challenges of maintaining supply lines to frontier research stations. Captain Chen, he said when Sarah approached the group, his large dark eyes studying her with what appeared to be mild curiosity. I had expected someone more imposing to be commanding a facility this far from civilization. I find that expectations can be misleading, Sarah replied in her characteristically quiet voice. Perhaps we could discuss your proposed supply arrangements in a more formal setting? The meeting that followed played out exactly as Sarah had anticipated. Corvani presented himself as a legitimate businessman seeking to establish profitable trade relationships, while his crew began the kind of casual reconnaissance that pirates always conducted before deciding whether a target was worth the risk. They asked questions about the station's defensive capabilities, inquired about the value of the research being conducted, and tried to assess how much resistance they could expect if they decided to take what they wanted instead of paying for it. What they saw was exactly what Sarah wanted them to see. A small, understaffed research station commanded by a quiet woman who seemed more suited to filing reports than making tactical decisions. Security that appeared minimal and poorly coordinated. Valuable equipment and research data that would bring excellent prices on black markets throughout the galaxy. Your facility seems quite vulnerable, Corvani observed during a tour of the station's public areas. So far from any patrol routes, with such a small staff. It must be concerning, especially for someone with your background. Sarah caught the subtle emphasis on the last word. Somehow, Corvani had accessed her official personnel file and seen the same carefully crafted record of mediocrity that everyone else saw. We've had no security incidents since I arrived, she replied. I find that most problems can be avoided through careful preparation and reasonable precautions. Of course, Corvani agreed smoothly. Though sometimes circumstances arise that are beyond anyone's ability to prepare for. Pirates, for instance, or raiders looking for easy targets. Such threats require a more robust response than most research station commanders are equipped to provide. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah maintained her calm expression while noting that Corvani's crew had finished their assessment and were beginning to move toward predetermined positions. I appreciate your concern for our safety, Captain. I'm sure we'll be able to work out arrangements that benefit everyone involved. That evening, as the Prosperity's Dreams crew settled into guest quarters and prepared for what they believed would be an easy conquest, Sarah held a different kind of meeting in the restricted sections of the station. The personnel who gathered around her tactical display weren't the helpless researchers and technicians that Corvani had observed during his tour. Dr. Vasquez had traded her lab coat for combat armor that incorporated some of the defensive technologies she'd been developing. Dr. Mackenzie was running final checks on weapon systems that were far more sophisticated than anything the pirates could have imagined. And the maintenance personnel and research assistants were reviewing assault plans with the precision of soldiers who'd been preparing for this moment since the station became operational. They'll make their move during the night shift, Sarah said, pointing to the tactical display that showed the pirates' positions throughout the station. Corvani is too experienced to wait long enough for us to request assistance or verify his credentials. They'll try to take control of key systems, secure the research data, and eliminate anyone who might cause problems. How many are we dealing with? Asked Mackenzie, checking the charge level on what appeared to be a standard research tablet but was actually a military-grade weapon controller. 12 on the ship, plus Corvani, Vasquez replied, monitoring the hidden sensors that had been tracking the pirates' movements. Standard raider configuration, overwhelming force applied quickly to minimize resistance. Sarah nodded, studying the positions her own people had taken throughout the station. They're expecting to find a handful of frightened civilians and an inexperienced commander who doesn't know how to fight back. Let's make sure they get exactly what they expect to see, until it's too late for them to do anything about it. The attack came at 0300 hours, ship time, exactly as Sarah had predicted. The pirates moved through the station with practiced efficiency, taking control of the communication center, the power systems, and the main laboratories where they expected to find the most valuable research data. They encountered exactly the level of resistance they'd anticipated: scattered personnel trying to hide, a few security guards who were quickly overwhelmed, and a commanding officer who appeared to be in complete shock at this turn of events. What they didn't realize was that they were walking into a trap that had been months in the making, orchestrated by someone who understood warfare in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. The helpless researchers they captured were actually gathering intelligence on the pirates' weapons and tactics. The security systems they disabled were decoys, while the real defensive systems remained hidden and operational. And the inexperienced commander they dismissed was about to teach them a lesson about the difference between appearing weak and actually being weak. As the pirates consolidated their control over what they believed was a conquered station, Sarah Chin prepared to show them exactly what it meant to underestimate a human who'd survived the siege of New Geneva. The real fight was about to begin. Captain Corvani stood in the station's main control center, watching his crew secure what he believed was the most successful raid he'd conducted in years. The human commander sat in a chair nearby, her hands bound with restraint cables, looking exactly like what he'd expected, a frightened bureaucrat completely out of her depth. The station's staff had been rounded up without significant resistance, the valuable research data was being downloaded to his ship's computers, and, within a few hours they'd be back in space with enough profit to keep his crew happy for months. "You really should have accepted my original offer," he told Sarah, his melodious voice carrying a note of genuine regret. "A simple supply contract would have been much more pleasant for everyone involved." Sarah looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed too large for her face, her expression showing exactly the right mixture of fear and resignation. "I don't understand why you're doing this. We're just researchers. We don't have anything valuable enough to justify piracy." Corvani gestured toward the displays showing download progress from the station's computer systems. "Your crystalline formation studies alone will bring excellent prices from certain buyers in the Outer Rim. Add in your botanical research and the various technological innovations your people have been working on, and this becomes quite profitable indeed." What Corvani didn't know was that the data his people were downloading was completely accurate, and completely worthless. The real research was stored in systems he didn't even know existed, protected by security measures that his pirates couldn't detect, much less overcome. Meanwhile, the restrained commander was using micro-movements of her fingers to send coded signals to personnel positioned throughout the station. Dr. Rodriguez, the communications technician who'd washed out of navigator training, was actually a former military intelligence specialist who'd been assigned to the station specifically for his skills in electronic warfare. The restraints holding him were real enough, but the pirates hadn't noticed the small device he'd managed to activate before they secured the communications center. Deep in the station's hidden systems, military-grade countermeasures were coming online. Dr. Webb, despite his genuine role as a research administrator, had spent 2 years in territorial defense forces before pursuing his academic career. The fear in his eyes was real, but it was mixed with anticipation as he waited for the signal that would tell him it was time to stop pretending to be helpless. Even Dr. Tverin, the Villani xenobiologist, was more than she appeared. Her species' natural agility and enhanced reflexes had made her an excellent choice for specialized training that most of the station's staff didn't know about. Like the others, she was playing her role perfectly while preparing for something the pirates would never see coming. "Your ship," Sarah said to Corvani, keeping her voice steady despite the binding that was cutting into her wrists. "How many crew members did you leave aboard?" Corvani smiled, interpreting this as concern about potential witnesses to what was happening. "Enough to ensure that we maintain control of our transportation. You needn't worry about them interfering with our business here." What he didn't realize was that Sarah wasn't concerned about interference, she was confirming intelligence about the pirates' disposition of forces. 12 crew members had come aboard the station, leaving at least 3 on the ship to maintain security and prepare for a quick departure. The tactical situation was exactly what she'd planned for. The first sign that things weren't going according to the pirates' expectations came when their attempts to access the restricted areas of the station encountered problems. The security doors that should have yielded to their override codes remained stubbornly locked. The weapon detection systems they'd disabled were somehow coming back online. And the station's main computer was responding to commands in ways that suggested someone else was controlling it. "Vex 7, report," Corvani said into his communicator, speaking to the team leader responsible for securing the classified research areas. "Having some technical difficulties, Captain," came the reply, with the sound of frustrated cursing in the background. "These security systems are more sophisticated than we anticipated. Give us another few minutes." Sarah allowed herself the smallest of smiles while maintaining her expression of fearful confusion. Dr. Vasquez had designed those security systems personally, incorporating defensive technologies that were decades ahead of anything pirates would expect to encounter on a remote research station. The longer Corvani's people spent trying to break through doors that would never open, the more time her own people had to prepare. The second sign of trouble came when the pirates' attempt to contact their ship for extraction scheduling met with static instead of a response. The communication disruption was subtle at first, easily attributed to atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction. But, as the minutes passed and all attempts at long-range communication failed, even Corvani began to look concerned. "Jex 4, he called to the pirate monitoring the communications console. "Boost signal strength and try alternate frequencies." The Nexus trader working the station's communication systems shook his head in frustration. "All external communications are being jammed, Captain. Someone's broadcasting a wide-spectrum interference pattern from multiple sources around the station." This was Rodriguez's specialty, and he'd spent 3 weeks installing hidden broadcast systems throughout the surrounding forest while ostensibly conducting routine maintenance checks. The pirates could continue trying to contact their ship, but the only signals getting through would be the ones he allowed. Corvani's expression shifted from confident satisfaction to growing suspicion. "How is that possible?" "We disabled this station's communication systems." "You disabled the systems you could see," Sarah said quietly, speaking for the first time since the interrogation began. "But you might have missed a few things." The Nexus trader leader turned to stare at her, his large dark eyes narrowing as he began to reconsider his assessment of the situation. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Before Sarah could respond, the lights throughout the station flickered and died, plunging the control center into darkness. Emergency lighting came on a moment later, casting everything in an ominous red glow that transformed the familiar surroundings into something that looked distinctly threatening. "That's not possible," snarled the pirate who'd been monitoring the power systems. "We have complete control of the station's main power grid." "You have control of the power grid that's listed in the public technical specifications," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a new note of calm confidence that made several of the pirates step back involuntarily. "Unfortunately for you, that's not the only power grid this station has. The hidden power systems that were now coming online had been installed during the station's construction, designed to support equipment that officially didn't exist. As emergency power flowed through circuits that weren't on any schematic the pirates could have accessed, weapon systems that had been disguised as research equipment began revealing their true nature. Dr. Mackenzie's geological scanning array rotated with mechanical precision, its sensor dish reconfiguring itself into the targeting array for a defensive cannon that could have stopped a cruiser. Dr. Vasquez's crystalline formation analysis chamber opened to reveal a fabrication system that had been producing military-grade weapons and armor for the past 3 weeks. And, throughout the station, equipment that had seemed purely scientific began revealing modifications that no university research facility would ever have needed. "What is this place?" Corvani demanded, his melodious voice now showing the first signs of real fear. "Research Station Echo," Sarah replied, working her hands free of restraints that she could have escaped from at any time. "Though perhaps not quite the kind of research you were expecting." The lighting system throughout the station shifted again, and, suddenly, the pirates found themselves illuminated by targeting beams that painted them with lethal precision. Hidden weapon systems that they'd never detected were now tracking their every movement, and the helpless researchers they'd captured were beginning to move with the coordinated efficiency of trained soldiers. Dr. Rodriguez rolled behind his console and came up with a military-grade pulse rifle that had been concealed in what appeared to be a standard equipment locker. Dr. Webb dove for cover while simultaneously triggering a security protocol that sealed blast doors throughout the station, trapping the pirates in predetermined positions where they could be dealt with systematically. Even Dr. Tverin moved with fluid grace that showed extensive combat training, her Volani reflexes allowing her to dodge the panicked weapons fire from pirates who were finally beginning to understand how badly they'd miscalculated. But it was Sarah Chen who commanded their attention as she rose from her chair and stepped into the red-lit control center. Gone was the quiet, nervous administrator who'd seemed so overwhelmed by her responsibilities. In her place stood someone who moved with the controlled precision of a veteran warrior, someone whose dark eyes now showed the kind of cold calculation that came from surviving battles that should have been impossible to win. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the tone of absolute authority that made even hardened pirates pause in their panic. "You've made several critical errors this evening. First, you assumed that a remote research station would be poorly defended. Second, you believe that humans are weak simply because we're smaller than most other species. And, third, you confused careful preparation with helpless vulnerability. She gestured toward the tactical displays that were now showing the true defensive capabilities of the station, including weapon systems that could have held off a full military assault. What you've actually done is attack one of humanity's most classified military research facilities, staffed by personnel with combat experience you can't imagine, and commanded by someone who's forgotten more about tactical warfare than you'll ever have the chance to learn. Corvani raised his hands in surrender, his traitor's instincts recognizing a situation that had moved far beyond salvage. Captain Chen, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we can negotiate a peaceful resolution to this situation. Sarah smiled, and, for the first time since the pirates had seen her, the expression showed no trace of fear or uncertainty. Instead, it carried the kind of cold satisfaction that came from watching a perfectly executed plan unfold exactly as intended. "Oh, I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all," she said, moving toward the weapons locker that would arm her for the next phase of the operation. "You wanted to test whether a small human woman could defend her station against superior numbers and firepower. Consider this your answer." The battle for Research Station Echo was about to begin in earnest, and Captain Sarah Chen was finally ready to show these pirates exactly what it meant to underestimate a survivor of the siege of New Geneva. The next 30 minutes became a masterclass in tactical warfare that the surviving pirates would remember for the rest of their lives. What had begun as a simple raid on an isolated research station transformed into a nightmare scenario where every assumption they'd made proved catastrophically wrong. Sarah moved through the station with fluid efficiency, her small stature now revealed as an advantage rather than a limitation. Where larger opponents had to navigate carefully around equipment and, through doorways, she flowed like water, using the station's layout as a weapon against enemies who suddenly found themselves fighting in an environment designed to favor defenders who knew its secrets. The first pirate team to encounter her new demeanor was Vex 7's group, still struggling with the security doors that protected the classified research areas. They turned as she approached, seeing what appeared to be an escaped prisoner armed with a standard security sidearm, hardly a threat worth serious attention. "Stay back," Vex 7 warned, raising his military-grade assault rifle. "We don't want to hurt you, but we will if necessary." Sarah's response was to demonstrate why human military academies still studied the tactics she developed during the siege of New Geneva. Instead of backing down or seeking cover, she moved forward in a pattern that used the corridor's support beams and equipment housings to break up their targeting solutions while closing distance faster than they could adjust their aim. Her first shot took out the pirate's weapon with surgical precision, the pulse beam slicing through the rifle's power coupling in a way that rendered it useless without causing an explosion that might damage critical station equipment. Her second shot disabled the portable shield generator that the pirates had been using to protect themselves while working on the security doors. By the time Vex 7 realized that his assessment of the threat level needed serious revision, Sarah was close enough to demonstrate the hand-to-hand combat techniques that had kept her alive when ammunition ran out during the 72-hour siege that had saved New Geneva. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes and ended with 3 pirates unconscious, one with a dislocated shoulder who would need medical attention, and Vex 7 himself secured with his own restraint cables while staring at Sarah with the kind of shock that came from watching someone rewrite all the rules of engagement in real time. "How?" he gasped, nursing bruised ribs and a split lip. "You're just a research station administrator." Sarah checked her weapon's charge level while keeping one eye on the tactical display that showed the positions of the remaining pirates throughout the station. "Actually, I'm a military officer with specialized training in defensive operations, assigned to protect a facility conducting research that could change the balance of power in this galaxy." The administrator role was just convenient cover. She activated her communicator, speaking to the rest of her team in the calm, professional tone that had commanded respect in fleet briefings and strategy sessions throughout human space. "Rodriguez, what's the status on communication jamming?" "All external signals blocked, Captain," came the immediate reply. "The pirate ship is trying every frequency they can think of, but they're not getting through." "Web, facility status?" "All classified areas secure. No unauthorized access to any critical systems." "The decoy data downloads are complete, they've stolen exactly what we wanted them to steal." Sarah smiled grimly as she moved toward the next group of pirates, who were about to discover that the station's research equipment included defensive systems that could track targets through walls and coordinate fire patterns that eliminated cover without damaging vital infrastructure. Meanwhile, Dr. Vasquez was demonstrating that 3 years of weapons development had given her an intimate knowledge of how to use those weapons effectively. The pirates who'd cornered her in what they thought was a dead-end laboratory found themselves facing someone who'd literally written the technical specifications for the equipment she was using against them. "This is impossible," one of them shouted as his weapon failed to penetrate what appeared to be a standard lab coat but was actually incorporating the latest advances in personal defensive technology. "No research facility has equipment like this." "You're right," Vasquez replied, triggering systems that filled the laboratory with a web of targeting beams that could track movement faster than most species could react. "Research facilities don't have equipment like this. Military installations do." The revelation that they'd attacked not a peaceful research station but a disguised military facility was spreading through the remaining pirates like a virus, destroying their confidence and coordination as they realized they were fighting an enemy they'd never prepared to face. But, more than the advanced equipment or the unexpected resistance, it was the growing understanding of exactly who they were fighting that was breaking their morale. Captain Corvani, still trapped in the main control center with blast doors sealed around him, was frantically trying to access any information he could find about Captain Sarah Chen. His earlier review of her personnel file had showed nothing but routine diplomatic assignments and administrative positions, certainly nothing that would explain the tactical brilliance he was witnessing or the way her team was systematically dismantling his operation. "Computer, access military personnel database," he commanded. "Cross-reference Captain Sarah Chen with any classified operations or special assignments." The station's computer, still under Rodriguez's control despite appearing to respond to Corvani's commands, displayed exactly what he expected to see. A standard service record with no classified annotations, no special commendations, and no indication that this woman was anything more than exactly what she appeared to be. What the computer didn't show him, because it was buried under classification levels that pirate ships were never expected to access, was the real record. The record that documented her role in the siege of New Geneva, where she'd held a critical defensive position against impossible odds. The tactical innovations that had saved millions of civilian lives and earned her commendations from every major military academy in human space. The specialized training that had prepared her to command the most sensitive installations in human territory. But Corvani was beginning to piece together the truth from what he could observe directly. The way Sarah moved through combat situations with the unconscious competence that came from extensive experience under fire. The way her team responded to her commands with the instant obedience that was only earned through proven leadership in life or death situations. The way the station's defensive systems had been designed not just to protect research, but to turn the entire facility into a fortress that could hold off forces far larger than his raiding party. "Who are you really?" he whispered, watching through the security monitors as Sarah systematically neutralized his people with techniques that demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication he'd never encountered. As if she could hear his question across the sealed doors and monitoring systems, Sarah paused in her advance through the station to address the entire facility through the communication system. To any pirates still listening, her voice echoed through corridors where her enemies were learning to fear the sound of her footsteps. "This is Captain Sarah Chen, Commanding Officer of Military Research Facility Kepler 442b, also known as Research Station Echo. You are currently engaged in an active war against the Human Colonial Defense Force, and you have approximately 10 minutes to surrender before we stop treating this as a police action and start treating it as a military engagement." The silence that followed her announcement was broken only by the sound of weapons being dropped and voices calling out surrender in multiple languages. The pirates had finally understood that they weren't fighting a helpless research station defended by frightened civilians, they were fighting a military installation commanded by someone who'd made a career out of winning battles that should have been impossible. But Sarah wasn't finished with her revelations. As her team secured the surrendering pirates and began processing them as prisoners of war rather than simple criminals, she made her way back to the control center where Corvani waited behind blast doors that he now understood were far stronger than anything a civilian facility would ever need. The doors opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing Sarah framed in the doorway like an avenging angel. Her uniform was still neat despite the combat, her breathing was steady despite the exertion, and her dark eyes showed the kind of calm satisfaction that came from a plan executed flawlessly. Captain Corvani, she said, stepping into the control center with her sidearm held in a ready position but not directly threatening. I believe you wanted to discuss terms of surrender. The Nexus trader looked at her with a mixture of fear, respect, and professional curiosity that was typical of his species when confronted with something they hadn't expected. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? This entire situation was a trap. Sarah moved to the tactical display, calling up information that showed the true nature of the station's defenses and the military personnel who'd been disguised as researchers and support staff. Not exactly a trap. More like a test. We needed to know how effectively our security measures would work against a real threat, and whether our cover identities would hold up under scrutiny. She gestured toward the screen showing download progress from the station's computer systems, which Corvani now realized had been carefully managed to give him exactly what she wanted him to see. The data you've stolen is real, but it's also completely useless without the classified components that were never stored in accessible systems. You now have detailed information about crystalline formations that can only be found on this planet, botanical research that requires growth medium available only in our laboratories, and technological specifications that depend on manufacturing processes you don't have access to. The elegance of the deception was becoming clear to Corvani, and, despite his situation, he found himself appreciating the sophistication of the operation. You've turned us into unwitting test subjects for your security systems while simultaneously feeding false intelligence into pirate networks throughout the sector. Precisely, Sarah confirmed. By the time word spreads about what happened here tonight, half the criminal organizations in 3 sectors will believe that isolated human research stations are heavily defended and not worth the risk. The other half will think they know what defenses to expect, based on the false intelligence you'll be carrying. She moved closer to the restraint chair where Corvani was still secured, her expression shifting to something more serious. But, more importantly, tonight was about sending a message about what happens when people mistake human restraint for human weakness. We prefer diplomacy and cooperation because they're more efficient than warfare, not because we're incapable of defending ourselves. Corvani nodded slowly, beginning to understand that he'd walked into something far more significant than a simple military ambush. This was about changing perceptions throughout the galaxy. The Galactic Council has been operating under the assumption that humanity can be safely ignored because we're physically smaller and, apparently less aggressive than most species, Sarah explained, calling up intelligence reports that showed exactly how widespread these assumptions had become. Tonight's events will be carefully documented and transmitted to certain intelligence networks, providing clear evidence that those assumptions can be fatal. As if summoned by her words, the station's communication systems activated, showing incoming signals from ships that were approaching at speeds that suggested military urgency rather than civilian travel. The rescue ships that Corvani had hoped would never arrive were already on their way, but they weren't coming to help the pirates. Human Colonial Defense Force patrol ships, Sarah noted, studying the identification codes. They received our distress signal about 6 hours ago, when your ship first entered the system. They should arrive within the next 90 minutes. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place for Corvani. The entire engagement had been conducted under the assumption that backup was already on the way, that the pirate ship was already compromised, and that the only real question was how much intelligence could be gathered before the situation concluded. You've been 3 steps ahead of us since before we even landed, he said with something approaching admiration. Sarah smiled, and this time the expression showed genuine warmth instead of the cold calculation of combat. Actually, I've been 3 steps ahead since before you decided to target this station. We've been monitoring pirate communications in this sector for months, looking for exactly the right opportunity to conduct this kind of demonstration. She moved toward the door, pausing to look back at the pirate leader who'd learned more about human capabilities in one night than most aliens discovered in a lifetime. The next time someone suggests that humans are weak because we're small, I suggest you share tonight's story with them. It might save their lives. As Sarah left the control center to oversee the final processing of her prisoners and prepare for the arrival of the patrol ships, Corvani reflected on how completely his assumptions about humanity had been overturned. He'd attacked what he thought was a helpless research station and, instead, found himself facing a military installation commanded by someone who fought with the skill of a veteran and planned with the foresight of a strategist. More than that, he'd discovered that humanity's apparent weakness was actually a form of strength, the confidence to appear vulnerable while maintaining the capability to defend themselves when necessary. It was a lesson that would spread throughout the criminal networks of the galaxy, carried by survivors who would never again mistake human restraint for human limitation. The battle for Research Station Echo was over, but its consequences were just beginning to spread across the stars. 6 months after the incident that would become known throughout the galaxy as the Echo Station engagement, Captain Sarah Chen stood in the same observation deck where she'd first arrived at Kepler 442b, watching as the latest supply ship completed its approach. This time, however, the vessel bore the insignia of the Galactic Council itself, and its passenger manifest included some of the most influential beings in known space. The transformation of Research Station Echo had been remarkable. What had once appeared to be a small, isolated outpost was now openly acknowledged as one of humanity's premier military research facilities. The defensive systems that had been hidden were now prominently displayed as a warning to potential threats. The military personnel who had masqueraded as researchers were now operating under their real identities and ranks. And Sarah herself had shed the facade of the quiet administrator in favor of her actual role as a decorated military strategist. But the most significant change wasn't in the station itself, it was in how the galaxy viewed humanity. The first delegation to arrive had been from the Zephyrian Empire, led by none other than Commander Throck, who'd spent the journey from Terra Station questioning Sarah's qualifications. His forearms were still crossed over his massive chest as he disembarked from the transport, but his expression was one of respectful wariness rather than dismissive contempt. "Captain Chen," he said, offering the formal salute that Zephyrian warriors reserved for proven enemies. "I have been instructed by the Imperial Command to personally apologize for any misconceptions that may have influenced our previous interactions." Sarah returned the salute with the precision that had been drilled into her at the academy, though her expression remained diplomatically neutral. "No apology necessary, Commander. Assumptions based on incomplete information are natural. What matters is how we adapt when new data becomes available." The Zephyrian commander's reptilian features shifted into what might have been a smile. "Indeed. The Imperial Intelligence Service has reviewed the tactical reports from the Echo Station engagement extensively. Your defensive strategy has been incorporated into our training scenarios as an example of how numerical and physical advantages can be neutralized through superior preparation and battlefield awareness." This was perhaps the highest compliment the Zephyrian Empire could offer, acknowledgement that a human's tactical innovations were worth studying by their warrior caste. But Throck wasn't finished with his revelations. "There have been significant changes in Imperial policy regarding human settlements in frontier territories," he continued. "Previously, we classified such outposts as minimal threat and allocated patrol resources accordingly. That classification has been revised to unknown capability pending direct assessment." Sarah nodded, recognizing the strategic implications. Throughout the galaxy, military planners were being forced to reconsider their assumptions about human defensive capabilities. The idea that small, isolated human facilities were easy targets had been permanently dispelled, replaced by a healthy respect for what might be hidden beneath an apparently peaceful exterior. The next arrival was even more significant, a full diplomatic delegation from the Nexus Trading Collective, led by Ambassador Kix-7, one of the most influential voices in the Collective's council. Unlike Captain Corvani, who'd learned about human capabilities the hard way, Kix-7 approached the station with the careful respect of someone who'd studied the engagement records and understood their implications. "Captain Chen," the ambassador said, his melodious voice carrying none of the condescension that had characterized Corvani's approach. "The Collective wishes to express its profound regret regarding the actions of certain rogue elements operating under fraudulent credentials. Captain Corvani and his crew have been permanently expelled from our organization and their trading licenses revoked throughout Collective space." This was more than a simple apology, it was a clear signal that the Nexus Trading Collective was distancing itself from any organization or individual who might threaten human installations. The economic implications were enormous, as the Collective's influence extended throughout the galaxy's commercial networks. "The Collective also wishes to propose a formal security cooperation agreement," Kix-7 continued, presenting a datapad with terms that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "We believe that our commercial operations would benefit from the kind of robust security measures that humanity has demonstrated the ability to provide." Sarah reviewed the proposal with interest, noting clauses that would effectively position humanity as a major player in galactic security arrangements. The Nexus Trading Collective was offering to pay substantial fees for human protection of their most valuable commercial operations, based entirely on the reputation earned during a single engagement. But the most remarkable visitor was Dr. Ilex, the Alterian medical officer who'd expressed concern about Sarah's psychological well-being during that first journey to the station. The empathic alien approached with the careful respect that her species showed when they'd seriously misjudged someone's emotional state. "Captain, I must admit that my initial assessment of your suitability for this assignment was flawed," she said, her large eyes showing genuine embarrassment. "My species prides itself on our ability to read the emotional states of others, but I completely failed to recognize the confidence and competence that were clearly present beneath your quiet demeanor." Sarah smiled, remembering how concerned Dr. Ilex had been about the psychological impact of isolation and command responsibility. "Your concern was appreciated, Doctor. But perhaps it demonstrates that strength isn't always expressed in ways that are obvious to other species." The Alterian nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. The Alterian Medical Council has begun reviewing our psychological assessment protocols for humans. We're discovering that many traits we interpreted as weakness or vulnerability are actually forms of strength that we simply didn't recognize." This revelation had implications that extended far beyond individual assessments. Throughout the galaxy, the species that prided themselves on their ability to understand others were being forced to reconsider their assumptions about human psychology and capabilities. The formal ceremonies concluded with a presentation that Sarah had never expected to receive, a commendation from the Galactic Council itself, recognizing her role in advancing interspecies understanding through the demonstration of previously unrecognized defensive capabilities. The language was diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. The galaxy's most powerful organization was formally acknowledging that they'd underestimated humanity. As the various delegations prepared to depart, Sarah found herself in conversation with Admiral Harrison, her former commander who'd arrived with the final wave of visitors. They stood in the restricted areas of the station, surrounded by the weapons and defensive systems that were no longer secret, discussing the broader implications of what had been accomplished. "The intelligence reports are remarkable," Harrison said, studying displays that showed how information about the engagement had spread throughout criminal networks across 3 sectors. "Pirate attacks on human installations have dropped by 70% in the past 6 months. The ones that do occur are far more cautious and generally retreat at the first sign of organized resistance." Sarah nodded, watching through the viewscreen as the various ships prepared to depart for their home systems, each carrying new understanding of human capabilities. More importantly, legitimate governments are beginning to treat human territorial claims with more respect. The assumption that we can't defend our frontier settlements has been permanently discredited. The Admiral moved to the tactical display that showed the current defensive status of human installations throughout the frontier territories. "We've had requests from 12 different sectors for consultation on defensive strategies. Apparently, everyone wants to know how to turn research stations into fortresses without anyone noticing." This was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the Echo Station engagement. Humanity's reputation for defensive innovation was spreading throughout the galaxy, creating opportunities for influence and cooperation that had never existed before. The species that had been dismissed as physically weak and technically inferior were now being sought out as experts in strategic thinking and tactical planning. But, for Sarah, the most satisfying outcome was much simpler. She thought back to those first weeks on the station, when every conversation had been filled with subtle condescension and barely concealed doubt about her capabilities. Now, when alien visitors toured the facility, they spoke to her with the kind of respectful attention normally reserved for proven military leaders. The transformation hadn't required her to become something she wasn't, it had simply required the galaxy to see who she had always been. As the last of the visiting ships disappeared into hyperspace, Sarah made her way back to her office, where the daily routine of commanding a frontier research station continued. There were supply requisitions to review, research proposals to evaluate, and security protocols to update. The work was similar to what it had been 6 months ago, but the context had changed completely. Dr. Webb knocked on her door as she settled in to review the latest reports from the crystalline research teams. "Captain, I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for this facility. When I was assigned here 3 years ago, I thought it was the end of my career. Now we're hosting visits from the most prestigious research institutions in the galaxy." Sarah looked up from her files, noting the confidence in Webb's voice that had replaced the uncertain concern he'd shown during her first weeks on the station. "You were always conducting important work, Doctor. The only thing that's changed is that other people are finally recognizing its value." As Webb left her office, Sarah reflected on the truth of her own words. The research being conducted at Echo Station had always been significant: the defensive applications of the crystalline formations, the medical potential of the adaptive plant life, and the technological innovations being developed by her disguised military engineers. The engagement with Corvani's pirates hadn't changed the value of that work, it had simply forced the galaxy to acknowledge what humanity had been accomplishing quietly for years. Her personal communicator chimed with an incoming message from Fleet Command, marked with the highest priority classification. As she opened the encrypted file, Sarah discovered that her reputation was opening new doors that she'd never expected. The message was an offer of promotion to Commodore, with assignment to command humanity's first mobile defense platform, a ship designed to provide the same kind of hidden defensive capability to multiple installations throughout frontier space. It was exactly the kind of assignment she'd dreamed of when she'd first graduated from the academy, the chance to apply her tactical innovations on a scale that could protect thousands of human settlements. But, as she considered the offer, Sarah found herself looking out the window at the forest that surrounded Echo Station, thinking about the research teams who were still unlocking the secrets of this unique world and the defensive systems that were still being perfected in the hidden laboratories below. There would be other opportunities for promotion and advancement, but there might never be another chance to see this particular project through to completion. She composed her reply to Fleet Command with the same careful precision she'd used to plan the defense of New Geneva years earlier. She was honored by their confidence in her abilities, but she requested permission to remain at Echo Station until the current phase of research was complete. There was still work to do here, still innovations to be developed, and still assumptions about human capabilities to be challenged. Besides, she'd grown fond of the quiet routine of frontier life, with its opportunities for careful preparation and strategic thinking. And if another group of pirates or alien supremacists decided to test the defenses of what appeared to be a peaceful research station, she wanted to be here to provide them with another lesson about the difference between appearing weak and actually being weak. As the alien constellations wheeled overhead and Kepler 442b settled into its night cycle, Captain Sarah Chen returned to her daily reports with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. The galaxy now understood that humanity's quiet competence was a form of strength, not weakness. The assumption that small and diplomatic meant helpless and vulnerable had been permanently dispelled. And, in research stations and frontier outposts throughout human space, other quiet officers were making their own preparations, ready to demonstrate that humanity's greatest strength had always been the ability to be underestimated right up until the moment when that underestimation proved fatal. The legend of the Echo Station engagement would spread throughout the galaxy, carried by diplomats and traitors, soldiers and scientists, anyone who'd learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving when it came to human capabilities. It would become a story told in military academies and strategic planning sessions, a reminder that the most dangerous opponent was often the one who looked least threatening. But, for Sarah Chen, it was simply another day at the office, another opportunity to prove that sometimes the best strategy was to let your enemies reveal their weaknesses while keeping your own strengths hidden until the moment when revealing them would have maximum impact. The galaxy had finally learned to respect humanity not despite their quiet strength, but because of it. And that respect would serve both species well in the challenges that lay ahead among the stars.